take the microphone, Mary. Thank you, Catherine. Now, I'm not somebody who really knows where capitalism is going, so I've approached this subject when I was asked to do it as somebody building on what we've been talking about today, the democratic republic. I come to it as somebody who's interested in republican citizenship and the kind of society. So I'm trying to see how we in Ireland can contribute to changing the capitalist system that we have. Now, republican citizenship is based upon the interaction of freedom and interdependence. That is, the individually free, autonomous citizen who's also a social being and part of a society where the freedom and flourishing of each one of us depends on the similar freedom and flourishing of everyone else. Now, this is the basis of the idea, the republican idea, of free, autonomous citizens cooperating to create the common good. And in the process, which is very important, developing themselves as human persons. Now, I think few of us would think that Irish society, as it's currently structured and operates, creates the opportunity for that kind of flourishing. And if we want a different society, how do we do it within the system we have, which is the capitalist one that we've been discussing? It seems to me that the only way that really Irish society will change, if a sufficient number, a really large number of Irish citizens wants it to, it has to come, I think, from the bottom up, not from the top down. And I think there is a very broad constituency in Ireland that there are many people throughout the country who are very unhappy in various ways with the state of Irish society, with the inequality of income, with the inequality of social goods and services, with the environmental damage and so on. Now, I wonder, can more of these people be moved from dissatisfaction to action? Many people do feel very dissatisfied but think there's nothing we can do. Can we build a momentum? And I thought that one way that we might do it is to look at ourselves as citizens in an international context, again as republican citizens. Now, in today's global economy and geopolitics, it seems to me that interdependence and solidarity must extend beyond our own country to include the citizens of other countries. Now, I became recently aware of an aspect of capitalism that I hadn't really realised existed, and that is Ireland as a tax haven. And this was through reading Nicholas Jackson's book, Treasure Islands, Tax Havens and the Men Who Stole the World, published this year. And he explains that tax havens are not just, as many of us think, strange offshore islands like the Cayman Islands, but right at the centre of the global economy. They're part of finance capitalism, respectable, established system of power that has accepted grand corruption, he says, as part of its daily business. And he defines a tax haven as a place that seeks to attract business by offering politically stable facilities to help people, individuals and entities to get around the rules, laws and regulations of jurisdictions elsewhere, offering escape routes from the duties that come with living in and obtaining benefits from your own society. That is tax, responsible financial regulation, criminal laws, inheritance rules and so on. And he argues that it has become a common idea that it's acceptable for a place to get rich by undermining the laws of other places. And so he looks at the common characteristics of tax havens: secrecy in various forms, refusal to divulge information, very low, zero taxes, sometimes offering services only to non-residents, financial services industry very large in relation to the size of the local economy, and most important, he argues, that the local politics are captured by the financial services interests and that any really meaningful opposition to this offshore business model has been eliminated. So that system allows not multinational companies, for example, to set up various subsidiaries in different locations around the world, depending on the available facilities in each. And so you direct your costs and your profits and so on, each one to the subsidiary based on the most favourable area to maximise your company's profits. And then, in trade with poorer countries, which is usually the export of raw materials, this deprives these countries of the taxes needed to develop economically, including developing their own manufacturing and processing industries. In the case of much of the foreign aid that we give, that people from the West give, it facilitates local corruption, where local elites can raid their own country's wealth and collude with Western financiers and businessmen to hide it offshores, with both parties benefiting. And so when we express horror at corruption sometimes of local elites in some countries, in some African countries, we don't usually look beyond and say who's involved in this, how can it be done, and who else is benefiting? And then Jackson identifies the four main groups of tax havens. There's a European one, talks of Switzerland, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and so on. The British zone, which spans the world of the former British Empire, centred in the city of London. A more recent US-centred zone, and a few kind of unclassified ones. He includes countries like Uganda, different countries on their own. Now, the British zone, he thinks, is the most important. It comprises half the total of this business, and it developed from the 1950s on with the Bank of England, a leading player. And it's based on the City of London, but it's centred at a network which is based on a post-colonial network with three main layers, two inner rings, the Crown dependencies of Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, and then overseas, the Cayman Islands, substantially controlled by Britain. Then the third outer ring has havens, array of havens, Hong Kong, Dubai and Ireland is among those. And using Ireland, he uses articles by Jim Stewart, a senior lecturer in finance in Trinity, regarding the Irish Financial Services Centre set up in 1987, with help, he says, from City of London interests. And this currently hosts half of the world's, according to Stewart, top 50 financial institutions. And the attractions that we offer include low tax, indeed, as we know, but that's not, he says, the main draw. Being in the euro currency zone is one, a wide array of tax treaties with other countries is another, ticking boxes that fund regulators need at home is a third. But most of all, he says, the biggest attraction seems to be our light touch regulation, which we know affects so much in our economy. And the Irish Financial Service Centre, according to Stewart, is a showcase for high-risk, Wild West financial capitalism. Now that's us. By the way, Conor McCabe's book, which has been mentioned a number of times today, Sins of the Father, tracing the decisions that shaped the Irish economy, very recently published, he traces actually the historical development of that actually led eventually not only to the bailout, but to the Irish Financial Services Centre. And the theme of his book, which is very, very interesting, that a kind of a middleman dominant force in Irish, modern Irish capitalism, with the Irish entrepreneur and business as a middleman. He traces the roots right back to the Cromwell settlement in the middle of the 17th century, which I won't go into all the details there, was very, very interesting, leading to a pattern of stock raising for the export of live cattle to England. And this role of Ireland as a provider of agricultural produce, largely live cattle, for British industrial centres continued after the Act of Union, and it resulted in domestic economic power blocks of ranchers and graziers in Ireland, who resisted, of course, attempts at reforming that or developing processing industries at home. And this continued right into the setting up of the Irish Free State after partition. And he thinks that the resulting lack of a strong industrial base contributed to the fact that when pressures came on actually to move into the industrial area, that when it came after World War II, that in the late 1950s and early 60s, Sean Lemass and T.K. Whitaker, instead, he argues, of developing or creating export-led Irish industries, they decided to import fully developed foreign-owned companies, offering them tax incentives and light regulation and so on. And he talks about, of course, as we've talked about, what that does to the Irish economy. He points out that, for instance, that in 2009, if you add together, on the one side, the corporate tax that these companies have paid and their payroll, what they pay to their Irish employees and what they pay for Irish materials and services, and if you balance that against their sales, and those go overseas and outside Ireland, he finds that about 80% of the product actually bypasses the Irish economy. He sees the same emphasis on this foreign investment, tax breaks, incentives, operating in our mineral, oil and gas resources and how we handle those, in the house building boom, funding speculation with tax breaks and so on. And he argues that when the Irish Financial Services was set up in 1987 as a low tax zone for international financial services, it was kind of an almost a natural, if you like, progression of this. And he points out that not only that, but our Irish Financial Services Centre became a tax haven for Irish financial and commercial interests as well as foreign. And many of the Irish firms moved in there, avoiding tax themselves, and actually distorting, as he points out, employment figures in many ways. So the Irish capitalism then seems to be part of a global system that facilitates individuals and large companies to increase their own wealth at the expense of their own citizens, that will affect us here in Ireland, but also to exploit and drain wealth of developing countries. Now, we know that there is very strong support in Ireland from the Irish public generally for giving aid to developing countries. And Irish development workers are aware of the harm that are done to these countries where they work, both by the International Monetary Fund and World Trade Organization policies, but also by the EU, of which we are part, and our tax haven system. The 2011 spring issue of COLOV, that's their publication. COLOV are the Organisation of Development Workers in Global Solidarity, and they publish Focus on Action for Global Justice. In this issue, they discusses the EU's raw material initiatives of 2008. And one proposal there aims to stop developing countries taxing exports of raw materials and regulating foreign investment. And these taxes are very important to those countries because the export of raw materials accounts for over 70% of most African countries' exports. And these taxes, if they get them, allow their governments to fund education and other services, develop manufacturing and processing by providing the incentive to keep the raw materials in the country. And also, they point out that regulation of foreign investment can help minimise potential negative impact on environment, another issue dear to many people in Ireland, and on human rights. And that these negative impacts often come with foreign investment in extractive industries. And then, in the summer issue, they explain how the EU, unable to get all it wants from World WTO policies, is now going for economic partnership agreements with individual countries in Africa, in the Caribbean and the Pacific, something like, I think, 76 countries in all, including many, nearly half of them among the least developed countries, and looking for free trade deals elsewhere. And these deals, they point out, are in the interest of European corporations, new markets and resources to maximise profits. And they feel in these developing countries, they fear for their impact on jobs, livelihoods, human rights and the environment. Now, in the same issue, another article points out that development workers have watched and criticised these policies, the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization policies, in poorer countries for decades, and asks, is written by Deirdre Kelly, why they have been silent so long about Ireland, when they are uniquely placed to offer us wisdom on when we're dealing with the very same issues with the same kind of policies. This article, she points to Ecuador, Argentina, Iceland as countries that rejected IMF policies and actually survived, and asks, what can Ireland learn from other countries? Big questions arise, she points out, such as how the current system allows or pushes countries into debt, and why the poor in the global south, or in Ireland, she's linking the two, are always the ones to pay back rich people's debt. We have to address these. And she says the first step in changing the system could be to find here in Ireland alternative ways of dealing with our own debt. So Ireland seems then at present to be suffering ourselves from the effects of IMF and EU policies, and at the same time we're part of the EU that is exploiting other countries, and our government policy is part of the system of tax havens that exploit other countries. I was wondering, can more understanding of the relationship between all these things, between what is happening in Ireland to Irish citizens, with what is happening to citizens in the wider world, help in building a broad base of support in Ireland, for active support of policies to change the current capitalist system? And possible approaches seem to me that if we could bring discussion and information about the implications, first of all, of building employment in Ireland by competing all the time for foreign direct investment in Ireland. Do we ever ask what does that mean for the people in the countries where we're trying to attract the companies here? If they move from, we're very sad if they move elsewhere. What happens if they move here from somewhere else? Then, secondly, there's a suggestion in Focus, the Development Workers journal, that our first step towards trying to change the global system could be to start at home by trying to find alternative ways of dealing with our own debt. Now that adds another dimension to the challenges to the Irish debt issue, and it would link the really strong Irish sympathy that we know and goodwill that exists towards poorer countries to the need for change at home, the interaction there. This would be strengthened if we can inform ourselves and Irish society in general more about the reality and the implications of our status as a tax haven. Then another one is some of the rising evidence about the actual impact of inequality in income and the favourable results of less inequality in income. And here I'm looking at the book that some of you may have read, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, published in 2009. both professors of epidemiology, and they're attached to the University of York. And they compile statistics from developed countries, from official sources, on a wide range of things. They looked at such issues as happiness, which they judged in terms of measures of community life and social relations. They looked at the levels of mental health, that is illness and drug use. They looked at physical health and life expectancy statistics, obesity statistics, figures on children's educational performance, the incidence of teenage births, of homicide, of rates of imprisonment, and of social mobility. And they planned all these, all from official sources, on graphs, where on one side they have a line showing you the level of inequality of income within that particular society, and then on the other, how it rates upon all these issues. And it's very, very interesting, because there is a consistent pattern that there is a better outcome for a country if there is the less inequality in income that you have. However the income is gathered, if you look at the actual income people get, the less inequality that there is, the better countries rate on all these issues. The change, the improvement they found in the figures is biggest, as we might understand, for the poor, and we might expect that for the poor in society, but actually they found it applies to the rich also. And Ireland, they found, was consistently at the middle range in inequality and also in our level on all these different issues. At the good end, so to speak, the less inequality and better results on the various categories, the Scandinavian countries and Japan fared particularly well. And at the other end, the United States actually were at the top end on inequality of income. Now, the authors of the Spirit level, they argue that many people, many individuals in society, and I think that goes for here in Ireland too, would like the idea, would say, yes, we have far too much income inequality, we'd like more income equality. But the prevailing neoliberal consensus tells them that everybody benefits from a competitive society, that entrepreneurs make it happen, and that the trickle-down effect rises us all. Now, if people can see, if we can all see actual evidence that everyone in a society actually benefits from less income inequality, they argue it could then begin to appear a more realisable objective, one worth actually supporting, reducing the inequality in income. And they argue that at this stage, they put it, creating the political will to make society more equal is more important than pinning our colours to a particular set of policies to reduce inequality. First, what kind of society do we want? Then to develop the policies. And in that connection, I was just very interested in an article in the Monthly Review of July-August 2010, which published a translation of Martha Harnaker's book on Latin America and 21st century socialism, Inventing to Avoid Mistakes. Now, Martha Harnaker is a Chilean socialist thinker and political analyst, now based in a research institute in Venezuela. And what she did was she looked at a wide range of the Latin American countries where in recent years left-wing governments of various hues, all sorts of hues, have come into power through elections. And in societies with very different kinds of societies, all of them with kind of state apparatus suited to a capitalist system, and they faced the challenge of trying to develop a socialist state. And her idea, again, fits with the kind of thinking that I've been describing in these other things, of a transition to socialism, rather than an imposition from above. This informs her thinking and analysis. Each country she's looking at has a different history. The people working for a transition may have been very different. They may have been working class parties, they may have been indigenous and peasant movements, they may have been liberation theologians, they may have been a section of the military, they may have been charismatic leaders. They're all different. And so the idea is, starting with what is inherited, they're all trying to transition peacefully, not by force. And she argues very strongly to do this by active involvement of the citizens themselves. She sees people as social beings, and she sees that 21st century, good 21st century socialism, its objective is full human development. And with the idea that as people transform society, in the process they transform themselves. And in this context, she discusses the development of cooperatives. It's very interesting the way in which she discusses it, with real worker control, with real worker thinking and education, with real worker responsibility to the community and so on. But the ideas that she's expressing there, it's so interesting, they're the ideas that are central to those of Republican citizenship. Now, it seems to me that in Ireland there are many committed thinkers and activists with very different and interesting ideas as to the solutions and the policies. And indeed we have heard, and I'm sure we'll hear more very valuable contributions here at this weekend. But there is also, and I think we need it, a broad political potential political constituency which has not been engaged. And that potential, if we're to engage these people and bring them, you know, into the move to create a broad political will for change, that's absolutely necessary if we are going to achieve any change. We need, I think, those of us who are committed to change to keep trying to develop a forum or forums for ongoing, serious debate where we really try to draw on the knowledge, the information, the ideas that come from different experiences and even from different political affiliations, and where we listen to each other with the one proviso that the proponents, the people involved, are agreed that the present economic and political structures of Irish society do not and cannot produce a society in which all individuals have the opportunity to be free and to develop their full potential as human beings. Where we ask what we can change now in these forums, what we can change now in the immediate future, and debate about what we can build towards. Always, I think, very important, aware that we can make mistakes, but if we can we can always admit them and try again. Thank you.